going up. Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, where we look at ideas and concepts from Bowen family systems theory in brief and understandable ways. Today, we are looking at the concept of differentiation of self again, specifically looking at counseling or coaching, as it is often called in Bowen theory. Joining Katie and I today for this last episode of the season is Kathleen, Cotter, Cauley, who was here on the first episode. So welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, both. Good to be back.
Kathleen joins us from Virginia and is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She has a private practice consulting individuals, couples, and families in personal and professional relationships. Kathleen is a faculty member of the Bowen Center and has been faculty of extraordinary leadership and systems leadership seminars. She is a co-founder of the Florida Family Research Network, and her community service efforts are quite varied, from working with guide dogs for decades to being part of review boards dealing with sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church. And if I read your Bowen Center bio correctly, you began studying Bowen theory in the early 1980s. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, which means that you have been part of Bowen coaching since I was a toddler. So my plan is to glean a lifetime of wisdom in the next 30 minutes. Yeah, do you want to start us off with what coaching and Bowen theory is?
Okay, this was a good exercise. So my pitch is this. The coach has a theory. This happens to be Bowen theory, but the coach has a theory. The client is the expert on their own life and their own family. The family diagram keeps things factual. The thinking happens in the coaching, but the action is out in life. And one coach can see various family members, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. That again is my longish pitch.
That was pretty good. Tied it all, so many important things in there. All right, I'm going to make my go. So I put for the pitch for coaching. I agree. This was a good exercise to get clear about this. I put a partner in the project the client is working on. I believe being a coach in Bowen theory means that you are also doing the work yourself. Thus, you have respect for what the person is working on. But also you come to this relationship with responsibility and expertise of knowing and being able to hold systems thinking and the theory in your mind while you're sitting with someone. And it's the ongoing effort of the coach to work on differentiation in the face of others. So that is my pitch for this. What do you got, Dixie?
Mine might be the longest today, actually. What comes to mind when you think of what a coach in sports does and where a coach is positioned compared to the team he is coaching? A Bowen coach is on the edge of the field and is in a position to see a broad view of the plays that are happening. A Bowen coach usually only coaches one person on a team, but will have the whole team in his mind as he coaches. A Bowen coach knows a lot of useful things about how teams move around on the field and can relay those things to the person he's coaching. But a Bowen coach does not put on his own runners and start a 3-legged race with that person. Firstly, because the Bowen coach has his own race in his own family, and secondly, because it's so beneficial for the person being coached to do their own thinking and planning for the moves they want to work on in the field. So practice with the coach is useful, but it's a game day out with the team. That's most important. All right.
Useful, Dixie, in the time of playoff seasons.
In another episode, I mentioned how I don't know sports, so I wasn't going to talk about it, but I thought with general sports, didn't name a sport. Maybe I can get away with it. And then for Dr. Bowen, now it's Dr. Papero that always says this, but I don't remember, was it Dr. Bowen who said this is a do-it-yourself project, almost? So Dr. Bowen highlights the therapy based on differentiation is no longer therapy in the usual sense. The effort to help or supervise someone in this effort has been called coaching, since it is so similar to the relationship of a coach to an athlete who is working to improve his athletic ability. The initial goal is to get the trainee started. Most of the learning comes as the trainee works toward his goal. The trainee is aware that progress depends on him, and this process is different from conventional therapy. And then a couple from Dr. Kerr. People don't need to be instructed on how to change. They need to learn what the obstacles are to change and reflect on them. Gains from Bowen theory based on coaching do not occur until the family member observes relationship processes and his or her part in those processes. And from Dr. Papero again, real change didn't happen in the therapy room, but in relationships with the family and the ability to think for self while in contact with the family. There we go.
So much in so little time.
Yeah.
So
I'm reminded as we start that Dr. Bowen's main interest was the theory. And although we'll be talking about therapy, consultation, coaching, and what happens and what makes it different, I think that really the focus was on the theory. And most Bowen coaches will then keep their own focus on theory. And part of that means that people are working on their own family more than on the family that comes in to see them. And one of the dilemmas for a new coach is, well, if I'm not supposed to be the expert, what am I supposed to do? What happens in that room? So I'm sure we'll be talking about that too.
I appreciate that. I said one of the things I went into when I was preparing for this episode was some of sort of the myths that I think are out there, or the way people think about Bowen theory. And the gift of teaching people who are new to the theory is you come up with hearing a lot of these things that people think. And I think so many of them were caught in here, right? The project of the coach working on themselves, managing their discomfort as someone is sitting across from them, talking about something challenging. I think that in and of itself is hard to teach. I think, one of the things I wrote throughout my examples today were all this action piece, right? That the work on differentiation is an action work. It is involved thinking and observing, but then the work of action. And so I think part of that coaching is sitting next to someone, alongside someone, while they're doing that action phase.
Mm-hmm. But the action is not in the room with the coach, right?
Well,
there's insight. Or how would you guys see it?
The coach in the room gets more and more and more clear if they're working on their own family. So what people can't see in their family, and then they're in coaching and they are learning and they are seeing and coming back to a coach. Without that, I don't think that people really see what's going on as they're a coach to a person to the same level. So many, many light bulbs go off. If a coach is willing to take up their own family, which if they're a Bowen theory coach, they pretty much have to do that.
Yeah. The part I want to punch up about that example, Kathleen, is I do think, there's some way that we'll say the therapist is not functioning as an expert. And I think I would like to differentiate. They're not functioning as an expert of the person in front of them and their family and their experience, but they are coming to that session, that work, with an expertise that they've tried this in their own family, hopefully. I think that's a responsible coach, and that they are studying a theory. I think that's one of the ways that a coach works on their objectivity and neutrality, which is one of the things that I think is important in working in theory, is they are doing the work. So they are thinking about it. My personal experience is that when I do work in my own family, I see things differently in the family sitting in front of me. And I think, I don't know that I understand exactly how that translates, but I experience it. And I think that's why there is this element where I think the person working as a coach does have some expertise in that they're doing the work, they're tried it out, and they're basing their thinking on this theory.
Well, and can we move to some examples of that? So I think there's so many things that happen. One would be the idea of sibling position. So if you have a coach who's a younger sister of sisters, and in front of her sits an older sister of sisters and brothers, very quickly the youngest coach can get into an adaptation or back on their heels with this older sister and not have any idea what's going on. How come I can't speak? Why am I frozen? I can't think of the next thing to ask. And if they've done the work in their own family and seen perhaps how this happens to them in whatever their sibling functioning place is, it will just become very clear when that's going on for them right there in the clinical setting. Another one that for me was quite shocking was taking various issues and looking at them in my family. Criticism, humor, the use and misuse of humor. How did money work? How did conflict work? How did alcohol work? So if I use the alcohol example, nobody in my family thought that drinking at home was a problem. And so I went all around the family and I said, what do you think drinking is? Do you think there were any people that had a challenge with drinking? And the answers that I got back were quite stunning. Well, if you're drinking at home and you have too much to drink, that's not really a problem. Or if you're drinking at a wedding and your behavior gets out of hand, that's a wedding. It's kind of okay. And so all of these answers came back and I said, no wonder I don't think to ask about alcohol in my clinical office. Because if it isn't a problem in my family, when in fact it can be quite a problem, well, I'm not asking. So a couple would come in and they'd say, every Saturday morning we do our budget and we fight. I never thought to ask them, what do you do on Friday night? Oh, we drink. It's the end of the week. We have a lot to drink. Well, are you hungover maybe on Saturday morning? Oh, now not only would they not bring that up, but I would not give them the opportunity to bring that up. And so just little examples like that until we move through the blind spots in our own life, often we don't even think of the curious question right in front of us.
Yeah, and going back to Dixie's coaching metaphor, I think knowing that for me allows me to widen that lens, right? To look bigger beyond just, your couple example is so great, to not just stay in and teach this couple in front of us some communication, but to really widen out and get curious about the larger picture.
Because the curious questions are what keep the coach neutral and what keep the family thinking. So that keeps always the family thinking. And to your point, Katie, otherwise the therapist is fixing, giving advice. What's my next solution? What can I tell them to do the next time this happens? Rather than what you suggested, asking that curious question.
I was thinking this is another place where I might throw one of those myths in, because I think one of the things that people think about Bowen coaching is that it's quite distant, that it's cold or not emotional. And I think that idea right there is, I think the curious interest you have about a person sitting across from you versus, which is another kind of supportive therapy, maybe where you tell everybody it's going to be okay. I think that it does feel warm. I think someone being interested in you, someone holding the knowledge that you're bringing to the session and being curious about it and asking really specific details, I think that feels nice and interesting. And I think the other part, one of the things Dr. Pepperow says in his do-it-yourself almost lecture that he's given was the idea of a support function. This is hard work working on differentiation, and the benefit of a coach to sit across and be interested and about someone staying the course of this work. I think that's a function.
Absolutely. And a coach who knows themselves. To your point, if that warmth is coming through, it's more than giving warmth or comfort to the client, but just the comfort of the presence of a coach who knows how to sit in the 4 patterns, for instance, so that they might see these mechanisms being used or described by the couple: distance, triangles, conflict. How much exploration has the coach done for their own comfort level to sit in that, observe that, and say, oh, this is just what happens in this family. This is just what happens. I mean, I would give an example of there was a big old fight in my family back in the 1940s. My grandmother and her sister cut off, never spoke again, never, in 20 years. And so my father, who grew up in this family, came to the table with, didn't really criticize his children much, and got very nervous when there was any conflict. Well, no. It's a not, no. No. Come back later. No, don't talk. So we then went out into the world, really having to learn about conflict. So if I had a boss, for instance, who yelled at me, I'm like, oh my God, and I'd run to my colleagues and just yelled at me. And I mean, it just that I was a new muscle, a whole new muscle to. So in my office, when a couple would be perhaps getting highly tense and going at it and having some conflict, I internally I'd be like, oh my God, this is enough. After about 5 seconds. And so I started working in my own life, in my marriage, in my family as a coachee. And my husband used to joke when we were first married. He would say, if things got a little bit tense, he'd say, now, if we were in your family now, we would build a campfire and sing a song. Can we keep going? I'm like, okay. So, but without learning to do that, I was not tolerating what was going on in the clinical setting, which is pretty bad. If the coach can't tolerate what the couple brings and they're a high conflict couple, not going to be very helpful.
Those that are therapists sitting in this room, I think I get so interested when I supervise other therapists to think about all the things you put into place as a therapist when you get uncomfortable in the session versus going through that process you just talk about. I think
Give an example of that, Katie. That's a good point.
I was thinking like the techniques, like, someone who gets really uncomfortable with conflict. That's such a great example because I think this is so common of a conflict in a session, and they'll hand out a worksheet.
Yeah.
Or they'll double down on their assignments of the things the couple should do in between the two sessions, right? Is to really prescribe that, or get directive. This is one I can fall into as that good older sister. Start getting directive. But I just need to do it ourselves. Yeah.
I think often people want, or occasionally in my years, people have wanted me to have had the same experience. Have you gone through, a miscarriage or et cetera, and that can be important to people. And the idea, I think, in Bowen theory is that maybe the specifics might be different, but in our own family, we will have all had different levels, like you say, Kathleen, of those 4 patterns, and those are the ways that people manage whatever the content of the discomfort is. And then people are often surprised to know that, I have my own coach, counselor, therapist that I meet with basically once a month. And then they sort of look at me like, you must have a lot of problems, right? But maybe that's unique about, I think, Bowen theory is that this is this long-term work in your own family that can often look like once a month for years, or it can maybe reduce down to a few times a year. But my hunch is that is different than other theoretical approaches to counseling.
Well, I think it's true. And I think a lot of therapists who are very invested in other forms of training do come and are very interested in Bowen theory and think the ideas are of interest and they should look at their family. But often they don't return because they're very invested in however they have been trained in whatever theory they are in. So when a coach does what you're suggesting, Dixie, and says, I'll often say, I always have a coach in my back pocket. I wouldn't be without a coach in my life. I do think it levels the playing field where the client sets the agenda and the therapist is an expert in a theory, but that doesn't mean that the therapist is not a human being. And so one of the things that I will also say is I have always believed some of the highest functioning people in their families come for coaching. People will say, well, why won't you call my partner and have them come in? They're really the one that needs to be here. I say, well, the highest thinker often is the one who comes for the counseling, and that's okay. It can make a difference, can make a big difference in how a life looks and how other people are impacted by that thinking.
This is my favorite story. Several years ago, when I was talking to my kids about whatever I talked about in my own therapy session that week, my youngest child said, you have a therapist? And my 13-year-old son, without missing a beat, said, yes, therapists have therapists. It all loops back. It's like the ultimate pyramid scheme. So maybe it's good for us financially too, I'm not sure, but more than that, it is so helpful to know who we are as humans in our family, because that is the challenge that most of our clients are dealing with, right?
You're also talking, I think seeing the family as an emotional unit is a big part of Bowen theory. And how does a person do that with a family sitting right in front of them? And how do people learn that in their own family, to step back and see, like they're watching a play or some metaphor? Oh, to see how their parents relate, and then one of the children steps in, and then the other child fights with that child. And they say, well, this is what is meant to see a family as a unit. Or out in public, you can do. I was at church, and I had to change the way where I sat. This was a couple of years ago, because there was this family, and it was as though the family as an emotional unit was being demonstrated right before my eyes every time. And the young boy was an altar server, and the parents would sit in the front pew with the older sister, who was quite, specific about how to sit and how to serve, because she had also been a server. And so the little boy would come in, he'd be looking around, and he'd sit down, and then the whole family from the pew would be, no, no, up, 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 up. And the little boy would stand up, and he would watch them the whole time, and they would be like, yay. And then he would do something wrong, and they'd be like, no. And you could see every single person in that unit shifting their position all. I thought, this is the family. Seeing the family as an emotional unit. And so how do you get that view? I mean, I don't know if you two have any thoughts about it, but I think you can see this a lot of different places.
Yeah. Where my brain goes with that is my oldest had a violin teacher who was this incredible, like she had played with a national orchestra in Europe, and this was her teacher, which was amazing. But on music festival day, when her students were playing, she would grimace these faces as the students were playing, and maybe not playing perfectly, but my daughter would notice, when we all noticed it, right? And to think, what is the difference between someone who can observe and see without that, seemed like there were some things on the line, maybe. And my daughter just sort of slowly stopped enjoying violin. I mean, probably for a number of reasons. It's a really hard instrument. I used to play it too. But that idea of how does one look neutrally versus someone who's going to criticize or someone who's going to pump your tires.
And I think people know when you're neutral and when you're not, when you're just pretending to be neutral or acting like you're neutral. Katie, do you have thoughts about that?
I was thinking about, the idea that I think it's hard to hold the idea of a system. I'll just speak for myself. It's hard for me to hold the idea of a system in my own family. And I think I have seen the usefulness of sitting with someone who has that perspective and just ask questions that give me good information to think about. And I think, with me thinking about the career that I've chosen, is I've seen that as such a resource in my own life and work, that, to be able to offer that resource to someone else and to relate to this idea that when you're in it, it's really hard to see it. Like I think, I just joke every time my coach asks me a question about a triangle, and I think, well, yeah, it is. And yet, I was struggling to really about that in the moment. So I, you know, love your son's comment, I think, on this feeding itself. I think, it makes sense to me that when I was able to see this as a resource in my work, to continue to think that I could be that resource to someone else. And not the yeah.
Having the knowledge of what are the markers that a coach has when they're not thinking systems. To your point, Katie, what goes on? How would I know right away in a meeting if I didn't have it? I couldn't think of a question is one. People cannot think of a good question. Then definitely that coach is off systems thinking.
Me is when I bog down into content.
Okay.
When I can really sit with, I think this comes up so much in couples therapy, but even with an individual, and I get really bogged down in content. And I think there was this movie years ago where the doctor served the function because the person in the town couldn't read, of like going around and just reading the letters, and basically was updating on the family gossip. And I thought, that's my marker. I need a visual often. That's my marker of like, Katie, are you just sitting here asking about the family gossip, or are you actually thinking about systems process? And I think that's one of my markers, is when I can just really, I start diving down. And then what happened? And then what happened?
Or bringing up what happened in the last session. Let's say people were in a month ago and they had a huge dilemma, and you don't know as a coach if it worked out or not. And so curiosity can get the better of the coach who says, what went on there? Instead of, they may have solved that and have another whole agenda. They might have just had a fight in the car on the way in. And so how does the coach hold their curiosity at bay and say, can you tell me how that worked out? Is that their agenda? Maybe not. So lots and lots of ways to your earlier point, that this is not an emotional theory. People have to know their emotion, regulate it, and know what they're asking and what's their job not to ask about.
And I'm gonna ask you a follow-up question on that one, because I like the way you said, I think the different ways someone can be curious with a client. I think we talk a lot about this element of curiosity with the client. And that was such a good example of the difference potentially. I'm interested in your thinking of curiosity for me versus curiosity on what's happening in this system.
How did they figure it out then?
Well, how many times in a family, again, if we took that back to our family, how many times do we want to be in the know about what's going on? What happened there? Remember they had that fight. What? Oh, so if people can take a look at that in their family, that it can give them a clue about what not to bring up in the office. It is big work, I would say, ongoing, forever work. And I don't even like to call it work. I'd like to call it an effort. Because it's an effort in a good way of becoming mature, responsible people, and what it takes to really get there. It's like,
to see it cascade. I mean, I did a paper on this idea that Bowen put out there about, if you get bogged down in one area, kind of work on another area. And I think, to me, again, at the benefit to the effort is just the interest of watching, all of a sudden I'm functioning different in my work system. And to be curious about that, I can hold someone's discomfort a little more, or when someone starts yelling at me or telling me I'm doing something wrong, all of a sudden it doesn't hit me in the same way. And so I think that that's the other piece of watching that, the work, if it's done in the system, cascades into other contexts.
Mm-hmm. And people might start to comment like, I don't know what's different about you, Katie. You might know that you've really been putting in the effort. But then say, okay, that might be another marker that you might not engage about, but that you would notice. What's different about my presence that was not there a couple of years ago?
Or if you're really watching, I was thinking about the difference of watching it in other family members. As you see yourself do the work, you're just watching another family member function a bit differently. To watch, an older sister who might just move automatically towards a younger sister, and to watch this element where if someone else in the family is doing some work, that person just shows up a little differently. Mm-hmm. And to kind of just be interested in how this lands and begins to shift the whole system.
And how to explain this to people who would wonder, why would I want to do all this? I don't
Great
have a
question.
good.
Great question.
We ask people to do it. We ask clients to put the effort in.
Yeah, it's I think Dr. Pepper talked about that in his lecture that he did recently for us. Is what gets people interested in the effort? People do hard things all the time. To think about and get something out of it.
Well, and I do think that people who come to the theory will, in hindsight, say I was in a lot of pain of one kind or another, to really even hear these ideas. That I would say in my clinical work, I was up against kind of hitting the wall all the time. I would run out of things to do after about 6 meetings and think, I don't think I'm going to stay in this field. I don't have enough solutions for these people. And there was a Bowen coach down the hall. I'd had 3 other supervisors, but people would come out of her office and kind of laughing about things and kind of life giving on and I thought, I can do whatever she's doing in there if I can learn that. And so I, asked her one day, will you be my supervisor? She said, only if you're willing to work on your family. And then the answers started to come. I had no thoughts of working on my family. I had 3 supervisors who encouraged me to work on the clients, come up with ideas, go to conferences, get some techniques. And that didn't work.
But I think that coach also demonstrated another thing that is really present that we haven't talked about yet, which is the coach defining a self to the client, which I think is an important element here. That what will the coach do and not do, and how do you get clear on that as your own work? Who will you see and not see? I think you said, Kathleen, one of the things that people say that's different in other models is, someone working from Bowen theory can see multiple members from a family system in different configurations and think about that differently than someone else who would say, I have to support this person, so I can't see this person.
And that is just that's about an hour-long conversation, and it's very important. So let's say Dixie has a man who calls her and he says, I have a therapist and my wife has a therapist, but we want to see you as a couple. And Dixie, as a Bowen coach, might say, what I say is, I don't know any family in the world who needs more than 2 therapists in their family. So I'm not going to do that. I know people who will. So families can have 2, 3, 4 child therapists, couples therapists, individual therapists. It's very confusing and can be, as I see it, quite irresponsible. Because if the family's not talking to each other, and they're not a resource for the anxiety that's going on in that family to help each other through it, figure it out, however the family does. How are we as therapists participating in families going down the tubes with each other? Nobody's talking perhaps about the real things they need to talk about. So it's a very important part of theory and understanding triangles. What are the triangles that people bring? It could be other therapists. It could be other friends. It could be all kinds of ways that people are going to keep doing what they do. But the therapist wants to know what are the triangles that are operating in the clinical setting that the coach can be very much up against. It can be a referral person, and the coach is thinking, oh, they referred me to this couple. What if it doesn't work out? What if they get a divorce? Oh my God. Well, and the coach can be all confused about what's sitting right in front of them. So lots of triangles that enter that clinical setting.
Well, then what comes to mind for me is that sounds like a bit of a tug of war then between each of those individuals and their therapists versus, a Bowen perspective will look at how the whole team, all the players on the team are operating together. So,
and it's news, I do think we spread that news that it's possible to see a coach in Bowen theory, and you can do all that in one place. You come in together one week, bring your grandmother the next week. You get to decide that. That is news to a lot of people because in our culture, it's not really the mainstream, which is okay. But I think we do have a responsibility to spread the good news, as they say.
And get clear in it for the therapist, right? So how does a therapist get through the responsibility of thinking, how do I see a problem? How do I think I'm a resource? How do I want to show up in a session? I mean, I think those are useful questions for any clinician, any person, I suppose, in any profession to kind of think.
How do I hold on to myself in that room if people haven't figured out the triangles in their own family and how to sit in them and look at them and see them? That's the training that I think transfers into the clinical setting that's so useful.
And I have to, I was going to say, my own learning, as I've said many times on this podcast, is I often have to put my foot in it to kind of see how it doesn't show up well. And I think that's the gift of being a therapist for, a while now, for over 20 years, is to just see the difference. Bowen theory wasn't always in my life, and to see the difference in just how I function and what I learn as throughout my career, and thinking about that differently. I'm just less burned out. And I think that's a resource to the theory. I get interested in what the person is working on in my office, but I don't take responsibility for them making change. I think that's a game changer in therapy.
Right. The three-legged race. Yeah, well, takeaway resources, questions for people. I can give you mine. One of my favorite quotes from Kathleen Smith was, "We tend to think of mindfulness as a solo endeavor, but if you can't do it in challenging relationships, what's the point?" And my thought with this idea of coaching is really about getting an understanding of systems thinking, of the family, how people operate, and then science will say we will feel calm and curious when we are sitting with someone who is calm and curious. Our family is not always calm and curious, and so that's where this action piece is. So I love that quote.
That is a good one. So I have two takeaways. One of my takeaways is, if any of this is interesting to you, find a coach. I think that's a useful, try it out, find it out. But I also recognize that a portion of our audience is people who are practicing and using this theory and are clinicians and coaches. And so my other thought for people was, this was really useful for me to take some time and sit down as a clinician and think about, how do I define what I do? What does this look like? Where do I get caught? What do I need to think about and work a little bit on? So I think that's a good challenge to put out there to the universe, is to sit down and think about the way you define coaching or clinical work for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of you. I think just to think it through after so many years of doing automatically what never came naturally in the beginning is a very useful exercise to remember how people come to the coach with confusion a lot of the time. And we can't assume that because we've been working for 25 years that they're going to get quickly on the page here. Now, my takeaways were giving other people room to think while the coach is thinking theory, always making the picture bigger, asking good questions, staying with the facts, and regulating self all of the time, working a differentiation of self in the room. And then my last takeaway always is, look for ways to see the family as an emotional unit in one's own life. Watch your pets at home. Your pets will play out all the patterns of your family as an emotional unit. Ears back, running away from conflict. Watch. And, natural sciences will show us many, many ways to see the family as an emotional unit.
Very
Do
good.
we have 5 more hours? Do we have 5 more hours?
Yeah.
Right?
What a great takeaway to end the season on. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you both. It's an easy format, and you two make it that way. So thanks a lot.
Yeah. And I will put up the Bowen Center, I think, has a link to all of the Bowen networks across the world where people can get coaches and training. So I will put that link up. So yeah, thank you for being here, Kathleen. And thanks to everyone who has tuned in to season 2. And I hope that it has helped bring some clarity to the 8 concepts of Bowen theory and even more curiosity about how they show up as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.